Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Delight to be here to speak on a subject which kept me in gainful employment for so many years and finally deposited me here. Despite a powerful and impressive speech from Alec Ferguson, I do intend to support the motion in the Cabinet Secretary's name, Presiding Officer, and let me assure colleagues around the Chamber that having looked very carefully at the amendments, we are prepared to support them. We have some slight reservations about some of the wording in the Labour one, but let us not get diverted into a debate about bits of the debate. Incidentally, my previous intervention, I made the distinction between bytes and bits, and let me just, before moving on to more substantive matters, expand your knowledge by saying half a byte in the trade, i.e. 4 bits clustered together, is referred to as a nibble. So there we are. It's come as a useful debate. I certainly know ministers and the Cabinet Secretary and I and our colleagues will be tramping many distant corners of Scotland, hoping for good weather, but also hoping for adequate mobile phone signals and the ability to communicate back with our officials using broadband, whether wireless or fixed. I'm sure members of other parties and members of our party who are not in the government will similarly be doing the same. Like the Cabinet Secretary, I do welcome the John McClellan review of public sector ICT. It is, of course, about delivering a wide range of benefits to rural Scotland, having the right communications in place. And these are not simply economic benefits, and it's been very clear from the debate that that's the case. We do, of course, need to equip our communities and people in those communities, businesses, with the appropriate technologies, if only to level the playing field, as well as to create opportunity to avoid further disadvantage, as well as to create advantage. So very much central to our purpose is improving rural communications. Let me just paint a few words about history generally and the role of communications in them. 8,000 years ago, the human race was essentially a herdsman culture, and at that time in Samaria, there are different debates about where and when this happened. I adhere to the view in Samaria. We first saw the settled culture that is the basis of our culture today. And from that point, communication became important, because instead of people travelling around, they needed to send messages to other communities and communicate with them. So the whole world started to change. We had the invention of money, which was the tying of knots on string when you put your grain into grain stores, and lots of things that we see today started from that. If you go to the Middle East, you visit the city of Jerash, you will find the cart tracks still in the main street of Jerash from 2,000 years ago, because transport, one of the first instruments of connectivity, became important. And as I referred to last week, the Romans created an empire that endured for some between 400 and 500 years, partly because they created a system of hilltop signalling that enabled messages to go from one corner of the European empire back to headquarters in Rome in something like 6 hours. And of course, communication too, for Scotland, was very important. The Reformation and the introduction of the Bible printed in English drove communication, drove education in Scotland. But an awful lot has happened in relatively short space of time. When I was involved at 11 a.m. on the 25th of January 1985 in the launch of the first universal access home banking system to allow people to look at their bank accounts, the speed at which that system worked and delivered huge value to people was down to the customer. It ran at 1,200 bits per second, and from the customer up to the bank at 75 bits per second. And yet we were able... Yes, I shall.
The Minister has raised a subject which I believe continues to be a problem in relation to broadband provision to this day, and that is that upload speeds generally provided are as little as 5% of the available download speeds. Could he tell me why this is, because he obviously has greater knowledge in that, whether it's simply a historical anomaly, or whether there is a technical reason for that? Because now we find that there are many more reasons why higher upload speeds would be of value as we develop the broadband system.
The member is absolutely correct, and I will try and avoid being overly tempted by this. The technology that is used is called ADSL, which is asymmetric something message link, asymmetric message link. And there were a range of technologies could have been chosen when we went broadband. It was felt that the pressing need was to get data out to people. The reality is, for rural areas in particular, we do need good speeds back to the centre, because businesses are serving other customers through that relatively slow speed. And so, as we move on to fibre, there will be opportunities to work with different technologies, which are essentially symmetric technologies, which give an answer to that problem for those who use ADSL on copper. Anybody else understand that in the chamber? Right, okay. I hope he did as well. But even on telephones, the world has changed enormously. I remember when my father, in 1958, made the first transatlantic call from our house. It was on business. One of his patients was very ill, and he had to communicate with a husband who was in the United States. It had to be booked a day in advance for 3 minutes. Precisely 3 minutes, no more, you didn't get more. It cost 3 guineas, which at that time was approximately 1/3 of the average weekly wage. Now you can lift a mobile phone, and for 6pence you can call the States on demand. So a lot has happened over quite a space of time. A lot more will happen. There have been lots of interesting technologies developed in local situations. Yodeling in the Swiss Alps was a way of communicating using the human voice. Alexander Graham Bell demonstrated the telephone in 1876. Bank of Scotland installed its first telephone only 5 years later, in 1881, when in Edinburgh we already had 300 subscribers in the Edinburgh telephone directory. Mind you, when the bank installed its telephone, the board required that the telephone not be used to conduct business.
Minister, could I stop you for a moment? Could I ask that members coming into the chamber do so quietly, please? And if you want to have conversations, I'd be grateful if you'd have them out with the chamber. Thank you.
The first digital communication between Edinburgh and London, electronic, was installed in 1868. It was a telegraph, and a telegraph, of course, is what opened up the west of the United States to the prosperous area it is. So these are just some of the many examples there are of historically how communications have helped. Elaine Murray said 3G coverage in Scotland is patchy, in rural areas especially so. Where I live, I pray for 2G. 3G is a distant memory. The map of my constituency has 2 tiny, tiny wee blue dots on it, which indicate where 3G touches. Frankly, for most of Scotland, you could hold up a blank sheet of paper, and the blue bits on this blank sheet of paper represent 3G. And that's why it's so important when we go 4G, that we take a different approach, because we're creating, whatever government does it, huge commercial opportunities for the operators of 4G networks, just as we have of 3G and 2G. And in exchange for giving access to these huge commercial opportunities, we should place different kinds of conditions on people. And one of the ones that might suit Scotland very well, for example, is a condition that phones for 4G should, at no additional cost, roam between different companies' masts. And why not? It doesn't actually cost them very much to do it. It would reduce the number of masts that need to be up, reduce the costs for the companies putting the 4G networks out, and deliver a better solution for Scotland. It is probably not one that is of great interest in densely populated areas, and these are examples of what we can do. We've moved on from the elections that I fought in 1987. I had to carry tuppences in my pocket and know where every telephone box in the constituency was. In 1992, we had the first generation of analogue mobile phones. In 1997, we had the first digital phones. Every time there's an election, things have moved on. Things move on very, very fast. Now, yes, I shall.
I was wondering where he thinks we'll get to by 2015 in his last 5 minutes.
Well, the answer is, of course, partly dependent on how our relationship with the UK government develops. We will work very closely with the UK development, proactively, will not be passive on the subject. We look at the achievements that we've had from Rhoda Grant, for example, in Finland. We have ambition, but we will work with other people to make sure that things happen. She also made reference to our fibre network put in by Ireland, and getting access to that for other purposes was difficult. I think part of that is to make sure that even when private networks are put in, standards are in place for the exploitation of that, even when they're licensed, that will create the technological solutions to allow other people access to the services that are available. Paul Whitehouse captured what a number of contributors in the debate described as the difficulties in the borders, an area where the bringing of the borders rail is one of the major investments this government will be making that will help one aspect of communications in a rural area. But getting communications that are electronic makes a real difference. We also, of course, have to look, if we have small businesses that are delivering goods to market via carriers, we've also got to look at getting the carriers to pick up in rural areas. We've got a significant difficulty in getting them to drop down. He referred to business parks as a potential source of connectivity for many businesses and people who work in rural areas, and I'm sure that is the case. George Adam talked of Sandra Webster's 2 autistic sons and about social integration. And I think there's something very important in that people in rural areas are more isolated. That's a fact of their living in rural areas. But increasingly, the existence of technologies, communication technologies, can shrink that distance. As families have moved all over the world, communications are an important part of keeping families working together, communicating together. And it's the same across Scotland as families move. So George Adam, in highlighting that, was absolutely correct. And Jim Hume, among others, talked about telehealth. It is difficult on a snowy night to get a doctor or a nurse or a midwife to a particular location. But if you can use something like a video camera via Skype or other services to help someone who needs medical assistance and provide advice, that is a real life saver. And I think it's important that we do focus on that as one of the many benefits that we can deliver. Now, Rob Gibson talked about the over 1,000 BT exchanges in Scotland and people who are paying for 8 megabits and getting half a megabit per second.
The Minister can start to wind up now.
He is correct that there are huge variabilities in speed. He is correct that we need transparency in what's being paid for and what is being delivered. That is very important indeed. Joan McAlpin reminded us it was only in 1985 that Vodafone permitted the first mobile call. Things are going to move fast. And in rural Scotland, we've got to make sure that we can support the outward-looking and dynamic communities potential that there is there. Our farmers, our fishermen, and all people who live in the country contribute to world-famous industries in food and in drink. The potential of our wave and wind power is vast. But there is more potential in rural Scotland that can be realised through the delivery of effective digital communications. And it is this government's ambition and determination that we do that, working with the UK government, working with private companies, but most of all, working with those who live and work in our rural areas. Presiding Officer.